Good morning, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining our second webinar. Really happy to have the attendance and joining this second webinar, which they've been very successful, and we've been getting a lot of positive comments around them. So I just want to introduce myself again. My name's Ian Hassard. I'm the VP of Product and Marketing here at RootSecure. And the topic we're going to be covering today is one that was voted in our last webinar, which is IoT, that we've dubbed Silent but Deadly. I think it's an appropriate title, albeit a funny one. Just to give you kind of a quick rundown on RootSecure, for those who aren't familiar, we're a cyber risk platform. We quantify cyber risk in all different forms, from a people risk to a machine, server, and network risk, and we aggregate the results to make it easier for you to understand and see your cyber risk. And that includes IoT, which is where we're going to spend most of the time talking today. And the first thing I want to kind of cover whenever people are talking around, Internet of Things technology, commonly referred to as IoT, is people think smart homes. People think, smart TVs or printers or, your doorbells or smart fridges, things that hit the media that are typically associated with consumer electronics, things that you would buy at your local electronics store and plug into your home and make something a little bit more convenient. But there's a few other layers as well. Like you've got the smart cars now, like most Tesla Roadsters and Tesla Model X's and 3s phone back over the internet to their base station to give telemetry and information back to Tesla. Your security systems are often monitored over the internet, or you've got some sort of external system like a Netgear Arlo or a Nest Cam, or you've got fire detectors, like the Nest fire detector or carbon monoxide detector. Those are all internet connected. But now there's an entire emerging space in the business and enterprise area around medical technology that's connected. Your scheduling systems for understanding where employees are in the world, when they're clocking in, when they're clocking out. Automation of factories. There's companies that are doing a lot around traffic optimization and internet connected traffic lights. And then there's even smart power grids. The number of smart power meters is going up exponentially, and they're being managed by third parties or by the power utilities themselves. And those are all internet connected as well to some degree or another, or network connected at the very least. These are all examples of Internet of Things technology, and they're all things that should be considered when you're thinking about this kind of technology. So just to put things in perspective, my common term for Internet of Things, or IoT, is Internet of Threats. This is a website called Shodan, Shodan, if you want to Google it and do your own research. But Shodan is a website dedicated to, or a service dedicated to, scanning the internet at large for all different networks that are publicly available on the internet. Specifically, they generate data around Internet of Things devices that are publicly available on the internet. So as an example, this is a map of North America where we've got Canada and the US, where I've looked for cameras, specifically probably IP cameras. And you can see in the example here, in the US, there's 26,316 IP cameras that are accessible to the internet. That's a lot of cameras. Canada is proportionally, 10% of that. So it's, makes sense. And when you look at the numbers, there's a lot of devices here. And this isn't even looking at all the other kinds of devices. This isn't smart meters. This isn't security systems or any other kind of devices. These are specifically cameras. And the nice thing about Shodan is it helps you articulate and scan and even look for your own network. You can put in IP addresses and cities and whatnot. But what's really creepy is what attackers can do when they get access to this. And this is an example of what you can do. So again, this information is from Shodan. If you go to Shodan and put in IP cameras and you filter down to a specific type of camera, you can actually see the live feeds from all those IP cameras. So these are ones that I've focused in on in Canada. So in this case, you're seeing a lab, you're seeing a shop that hasn't opened yet, You're seeing somebody's cottage, you're seeing another cottage or a house, another workplace, it looks like. So it's pretty creepy stuff when you've got these sorts of devices plugging in without understanding them, which is 90% of the time you've got non-technical users that are buying these devices, plugging them in, assuming that the security on the other end is already handled for you, and that's an incorrect assumption. So you're on candid camera if you've got one of these devices and you really haven't thought of the security back end. So here's another example. So a lot of people, don't think about printers as IoT devices, but they absolutely are. They, don't have a user that's typically operating it. You don't have control over the software. And so this is an HP printer. I filtered it to Canada just to make it a little bit easier. So you'll see here, there's a ton of HP printers that have been made publicly available on the internet. And this largely has to do with somebody's trying to make it easier for remote users to print, or somebody's trying to, just not aware and they just plugged it into the modem and it got a public IP address, solved their problem. But the bigger problem is now anyone can log into this printer from remote and run a test page, print really weird documents, or in my case, Simon Fraser University really could use a refill on yellow toner. So if there's any MSPs on here, you might want to sell them some new toner. But it's creepy when you start digging into this and find all the different IoT devices that are made publicly accessible and available to people. This is a problem that's universal across almost every country. There's a very large percentage of devices that can be taken over, used for malicious intent. If you're familiar with the Mirai botnet from a few years back, there was a number of devices that were used in a command and control botnet for a distributed denial of service attack. And those are just devices that had weak security that were publicly available on the internet that got taken over, and using a protocol that had a vulnerability. So the key point here is that your attack surface is always on the attacker's radar. Shodan is a public service, and they have paid service. If you just want to use this to do your own research, it's like $50 a year just to keep the lights on over at Shodan. But they're considered what I would consider a white hat service, which provides you visibility. There are tons and tons and tons of black hat services that are doing way more intensive password scanning and vulnerability detection and exploit, trying to exploit these resources and expand a botnet, which then can be leased out to the highest bidder to do DDoS attacks and do other sorts of scanning. So if you have devices that are on the internet, IoT or otherwise, and they are susceptible, the attackers know about them already. So if you've got something that's online, like a D-Link camera that you bought, that you didn't change the default username and password, you likely are already on a service like Shodan, but probably a million other ones like it that are on the black hat world. So I kind of want to dive into kind of what an IoT device is. And there's this misconception from many that IoT devices are some sort of magic that just work, and that they're totally different than your servers or your computers. And nothing can be further from the truth. They have hardware, like they use the same sort of wireless chips that you'd find in your laptop. They have Bluetooth. They have all those sorts of resources that you would find in your computer. They have memory and storage and network connectivity, Bluetooth. Sometimes they have some extra controllers that they slap on top of that. And then on top of that, they put an operating system like a Linux operating system and or a Unix-based operating system that does all the different operating system functions just like a normal computer or server. And then built on top of that, you'll find the application. So in this case, it's an ecobee thermostat. So there's an ecobee application that's providing this nice GUI on this LCD, but you still have those underlying layers, which are exactly like a computer or a server. So there's really no difference. And there's really no difference when it comes to a server from what vulnerabilities show up from Apache or other services or drivers or whatnot that can be exploited, they can also be exploited. And it's really up to that IoT provider to patch that device, because there is no antivirus or vulnerability scan or something like that for an IoT device. It really comes down to the capabilities and prowess of that IoT provider. So, the other misconception is that all clouds are created equal. I remember seeing the bumper sticker on somebody's car that cloud is just somebody else's computer. That got a chuckle out of me because it's absolutely true. Most people assume that these backends for all these things that they're buying, no matter what product it is, whenever they use the word cloud, we're looking at a Google data center, which has, security processes, everything's up to date. They've got 1 million security experts and a NASA-style SOC that are analyzing and monitoring everything that's going on the network. And nothing could be further from the truth. You really don't know where that device is connected to. If you buy a white label security camera from Amazon, you could be connecting to Bob's data center. And Bob's data center looks nothing like that Google data center. Bob's data center is bootstrapped. This is probably one of the ugliest data closets I've ever seen. But the reality is you have no idea where you're connected. When I say cloud, I could be running a service out of my basement and you could be connected to it, and it's just the security and everything that you're getting and all the data that you're transmitting, whether it be live camera feeds or Nest thermostat or Ecobee thermostat or whatever. It could be just going to some laptop that's running a service somewhere where if it shuts off, your service goes away. So keep that in mind, that you need to understand the reputation of the vendor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So, when we're talking about the backends for these providers, most of them are using AWS, like Amazon Web Services, or Google Cloud Platform, or GCP, Microsoft Azure, Rackspace, DigitalOcean. There are many others, and then there's also private data centers where people invest their time, money, and energy in building out their own servers. Really, it comes down to cost. If I'm offering you a dirt cheap service, it's likely I have to use dirt cheap hosting. And then when you use dirt cheap hosting, that typically means that you don't have the same resources as somebody that's using an AWS or an Azure or GCP. So let's just call that your IoT backend for hosting whatever you've got, IP cameras, thermostats, washer, dryer. Now let's look at your internal network. Your internal network, and I'll talk a little bit around design of your internal network later on and the mitigation of IoT risk later on. But your internal network, typically flat, you've got a 192 or 172 or 10 IP address that's accessible all throughout the entire network. You've got a server with really important data, and you decide to go to the mall or to Amazon and buy that no-name IP camera. And that IP camera, to offer its IoT services, likely has a service that lets you cloud store your data and be able to access it with an app. And that's a really valuable feature because most people have dynamic IPs at home. You can't just dial in and access your IP cameras. So these things create a tunnel to the cloud, which conveniently allows you to access your security camera footage from anywhere in the world, just like I showed you with Shodan, but hopefully with passwords. Now, the problem with this is when you establish a tunnel to a cloud, and if you remember that spaghetti mess that was Bob's data center, when an attacker is able to get into that data center because you don't know what their security is, and that IoT device that you bought from Amazon, which ultimately came from some no-name vendor out in China, is not doing security patch updates, there's possibly exploits that can allow the attacker to use that tunnel that's been created to that back-end service into your network. And because your network is flat and not segmented, your IP camera now becomes a conduit for an attacker to access your server or potentially other devices. Now, this is certainly a worst-case scenario, but it is a very real one. So if you look at the history here, Nest thermostat, password breach, Sonos, people hacked in so they could actually hear through your Sonos, and they actually, make your Sonos's play music that you don't want to hear. Ring doorbells. Imagine being able to see, when you're home, when you're not home, who's at your door. And then, of course, the infamous Target breach where the HVAC system was targeted, and then ultimately became a way that the data was exfiltrated through that network. So these are all very real examples, and you might think that that's the worst case scenario, but it is a real scenario. So we're going to run our RootSecure poll, and the first thing that we're looking for is, do you use IoT devices in your business? I'm going to give you a minute to submit your poll results. All right, it looks like we're coming in at 63% say yes, I have IoT devices. Seems to be changing and moving closer to 50-50. I'll remind you though that IoT devices are also IP connected printers. So if you're telling me you don't have IP connected printers in your network, I might call you a dirty liar. But you keep that in mind. So 50-50, I think you'd be surprised what counts as an IoT device in your network. I think if you really start digging in, it'll become more clear. But that's interesting data for us on the RootSecure side. So I'd say that at even my given home, and maybe I'm not the common data set, I have probably only 5 IP connected head-end devices like computers and laptops and cell phones. And then I think I have around 20 IPs that are, water sensors in my basement, or IP connected light bulbs, or I have Nicobee thermostat, IP cameras. I have Netgear Arlo. So there's a lot of different options there for IoT. And you're typically finding that most businesses and most home users have more, IoT-based IP devices than they do head-end devices like phones and smart TVs. So now we're going to move on to how do you mitigate the risk of the Internet of Things. And I'm not saying don't deploy IoT in your network, because I think that's unavoidable. It's too convenient to have things that are automatically doing things for you, running your, some of these services. Like I have security cameras that cost me, it was like $350 for the Netgear Arlo, 2 cameras, and I get 7 days of cloud storage in perpetuity. That's great. And I did my research, and I understand Netgear, and I monitor the threads to find out if there's any security risks with that device. And as soon as there are, I might disconnect it from my network. But right now, Netgear's got a pretty good reputation. So that leads into my 3 pillars of areas that I'll be talking about on the mitigation side. So the first of which is buy smart. So do your research. If you're looking at buying something, it's definitely not worth doing the impulse buy of an IoT device. Walking through the aisleway of Best Buy and saying, "Ooh, I want this," without doing your research, or buying something because it's cheap is often, you get what you pay for. But understand the device, understand what it does, understand what it needs to access. I'll share a checklist that I commonly use when I'm looking at IoT devices in my network, either home or work. But buying smart is the number one as far as I'm concerned. The second is segment access. So wherever possible, IoT devices should only access the resources they need. More times than not, I see that somebody just plugs something into the network. Often they don't even know that somebody bought something and plugged it into the network. So understand what those devices are, what they need. Most of the time, they only need access to the internet to work, and give them only access to that. Zero trust. Some people have told me, zero trust, that's the name of a product. I'm sure there's many companies that are trying to trademark the term zero trust, but zero trust is a methodology or a philosophy on how you should manage your network security. And really what it means is moving away from land-based connectivity and move to isolated services that are in the cloud or private cloud. And I'll talk more about that later. So first, let's go over that IoT checklist. Again, this is one of the first and most effective ways to secure your network from bad IoT devices is just don't buy them. So when you start looking at the indicators that are something that you might want to care about on buying an IoT device, look at the positive indicators. Does it only need internet access? That's fantastic. That means that I can give it its own micro piece of my network that only accesses the internet, so my cameras work. And the worst case scenario is a hacker can see my cameras. That might be bad, but it would be worse if they could get access to everything in your network. Do your research on the vendor. If you start researching Ecobee or Nest or Netgear or Xilinx or a million different vendors that are out there selling IoT devices, you might be unhappy with some of the vendors that you research and say, oh, it's a good thing I did my Google search to find out that they've got a pretty bad rep. They don't update their software. And that leads to my next point on make sure that the software updates for that device they've been doing regular software updates. Just to give you an idea, a vulnerability comes out for an operating system almost weekly, and it has to get patched on a regular basis. Otherwise, those vulnerabilities turn into exploits. Exploits get used against your hardware. So make sure that within the last 2 months, there have been software updates. Make sure that your device isn't using an excessive amount of bandwidth when idle. When you're looking at a Nest Cam that's always pumping video up to the cloud, that's what it's supposed to do, and that's normal. But if you've got a device in your network that shouldn't be sending data up to the cloud unless you're apart from a heartbeat, it shouldn't be using an excessive amount of data. So if you have the capability of monitoring that with your firewall or router, I recommend taking a look. Physically connected devices supported. So a lot of devices like Sonos's still support RJ45 plugin for Ethernet. And in those cases, you reduce down a lot of the risk of weak wireless, encryption. A lot of wireless encryption is hardware-based, and it's not something that can just be updated. So in the last point, when the device does support wireless, like most do, make sure that it supports the latest encryption standard and is being patched for the WPA2 vulnerability from last year, those sorts of cases. Looking at the negative indicators, a lot of these are just the inverse of the positive, but if it requires access to things like network storage or something else on your network, I would say run. A lot of devices that I've seen in the past, like security cameras, they advertise the great feature of, oh, we'll store to your network attached storage, which then means that I need access to your LAN and I need access to that. And most of the time, you're probably not going to buy a separate device just to store your IP cameras video. So you're going to use your file server that has all your precious data on it. And that's going to lead to a disaster, possibly. Is the software out of date? You can often find people complain about software patches. Trust me, there's enough people on the internet to grief and complain about a vendor. You probably just have to Google it to find it. Reddit boards, sometimes you're going to find people that just whine a lot, but most times you're going to find a common, commonality in the complaints about a device and a vendor. Find out if there's vulnerabilities. Even that Google is going to reveal whether those devices are known on the watch list for having common vulnerabilities. Look for miscellaneous connections. Again, if you buy this device and you see that it's reaching out to more than just one IP, understand where that is. Maybe it's sending data somewhere else. And if you Google and try to find a vendor that you've never heard of before, do extensive research. The number of times somebody's said, hey, I just bought this smart TV and it's a company name I'd never heard of and it was really cheap. It's installed with Android, and on that Android, it's got a whole bunch of crapware which is phoning to all sorts of different locations. Be wary of things that are cheap. And I'm not saying that IoT devices have to be expensive. I'm just saying do your research. So that leads me to another point here. And this is I'm going to reuse this graphic from last week or last month. Know what devices in your network do. The number of times people have been breached or have had whoopsies, I have these devices in my network because somebody brought something in, plugged it into the wall, connected it to the Wi-Fi. It's staggering. The number of times that people buy a Nest thermostat and they don't even tell somebody, they buy a new printer and they just plug it into the RJ45. Understand what devices are in your network. It's always hard to keep up on this. There's lots of free options for doing a regular network scan. Then there's a lot of paid options for doing network scans as well. But keep in mind that you need to keep on top of this. Otherwise, your digital footprint might be expanding without you knowing. So on the second pillar, just to talk around network segregation. So network segregation is exactly what it sounds like. It's dividing your network up in a logical way to provide you more optimal protection. So we're back to that network now with some IP cameras and with an Ecobee. I don't care about the vendors in these cases. I'm just using this as an example. But I also have servers that are important. I have computers that are important. And I have IP cameras that are serving a function, and I have a thermostat that's providing a function. So with no network segregation, I'm at the highest amount of risk that I can be. I've got everything that's accessible over a layer 2 or layer 3 connection. Any attacker that gets into any of these devices, if they did, would be able to traverse my network and start scanning for vulnerabilities or use those devices as a standing off point for other scans. This is the worst case scenario. This is how most people lay out their network. Maybe people on the call, obviously we're a more technically minded audience, so it's something that it's easy to not think about, and something that most of the end users that we see and most of the companies that we operate with are just, it's easy. Plug it in, away you go, it works, and it's not your problem because it's not your job to keep the security of the IoT camera. But that at the end of the day, it's your network that's at risk. So looking at one step of improvement is doing good network segregation. Just segregate your IoT network into its own network. Maybe these are wireless devices. If the wireless devices, just stand up another SSID and then set it up with its own network. Maybe your network's the 192 network, set up the 10 network, don't make them routable to each other. These devices typically only need internet access. Most IP cameras now, their bread and butter is the cloud storage and the cloud analytics. Same goes for the thermostat. As long as it's connected to your furnace and your HVAC system, that's all you need. As long as you can manage it remotely, you can still manage it with your computers from your local area network, but you have to go up through the security of the cloud and then back into that, so you don't have that layer 2 or layer 3 connectivity. And then, of course, getting even better is segregating the different functions into their own networks. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to show you that this can be done and achieved very cheaply if you are willing to spend $40. So being able to separate the thermostat from your cameras means that you reduce the risk even further. So if one of those devices gets taken over, the risk of what they can do is minimal when it comes to data exfiltration and scanning your network and getting access to other things. So again, this should make sense to most people. Maybe technically it's a little bit more complicated, but I'll give you an example of a way that you can do, and I'm going to use the term good enough because I think there are many optimal ways to do network segregation that can be more complicated. But here's option 1, and the only option I'm really going to discuss is buy another wireless router. And I don't mean another access point. I'm saying buy a router. If you just need internet access to your IoT devices, like most of them only require, buy a router, set it up with multiple SSIDs. This is an example of one that I found on Amazon, just to articulate how easy it is to get your hands on this technology. It's $34.99. It supports 4 SSIDs. It has a router access point. It's a range extender. It cooks julienne fries. So you can buy this for under $40 shipped, and you can deploy this in your network in line with your existing router. And this method would utilize network access translation, or NAT, to provide an extra layer of security. So if somebody were to access your IP cameras, the only way they can go is north. They can't go to your main router and get into that main router and then go into your network easily. You can't run a network scan and reveal that other network. This just provides an extra layer of separation. And again, this isn't the super main mega optimal segregation. I'm just showing you an example that this can be done dirt cheap and a way that's effective. So again, if you just take that router, leave it in route mode, give it its own IP address range, like the 10 network if you're on the 192 in your regular network, and then you don't have to, you just plug it into the regular LAN port on your router and away you go. So I'm going to run another RootSecure poll. So this one is more around, do you guys already separate your IoT devices? So, you know, for those of you who aren't, maybe you can just comment on whether you would or not. But I am curious for those who do have IoT devices, whether you've actually implemented any form of segregation. All right, it looks like we've got 71% saying that they do provide some level of segregation, and 29% saying that they don't segregate their network. That's interesting information. So it looks like you guys have already kind of got some of the best practices already going. So that's really great to hear. So we're going to close the poll now. But I do want to articulate that it is something that's easy to achieve and something that you can do. It looks like we've had some comments that have come in talking about the existence of IoT-specific routers that are just designed to achieve this purpose. That's something that you can do as well. Again, there are 1,000,001 ways to segregate your network and improve the security and make your network more secure with IoT devices. I'm just trying to provide you the cheap and easy and obvious ways that you can do this. Even at the end of this webinar, go on Amazon, buy that, and roll it out. So that kind of brings me back into, you know, the more complicated ways, and, you know, leading into my conversation about zero trust is, you know, again, most networks have their amazing network, which is awesome, not so much awesome, and it just connects to the internet. This is how most networks that I see today. You know, certainly the number of people on the call are an exception that are doing segregated networks, which is fantastic. But one is you can do VLANs for your servers and your IoT devices, and you can implement access control rules that only allow your network devices to connect to those networks and those devices. This is a more complicated way, but it's also one that requires regular maintenance. If somebody brings in a new laptop or brings in a new IoT device, or you introduce a new server, you have to be on top of these rules day to day. And most of the time people aren't. Day one, this looks great, it works great, it provides the security that you need, but very quickly gets out of date, people don't update it, the security gets worse, and that's ultimately what leads us into reading your company's name in a headline in a newspaper somewhere. So that leads us into the conversation around zero trust. Zero trust, again, it's a new concept, and I do want to raise that this is not a product, this is how you operate your network. You'll notice that my servers have disappeared. I still have my computers. I still have my IoT devices. But what I've done is I've introduced the, you know, just the concept of cloud hosting or remote hosting my accounting server or my network server. I've moved it out into the cloud. Again, cloud is just somebody else's computer. You can do this yourself. You can buy your own rack space in some local data center, put up a firewall, and have your own accounting server. There are 1,000,001 accounting services that offer accounting in the cloud. Companies are moving to salesforce.com for CRM, network storage. There's a million different online solutions there that you don't require care and feeding. And then you've got your IoT providers like your Ecobee and your Nest services. So when you look at an attacker's activities, you know, they typically get into your network. Maybe this guy just walked into the front door, plugged something into an Ethernet jack and left, and he starts scanning the network. He's not going to find any way of accessing interesting information. Maybe he installs ransomware on one of those workstations. That takes out that workstation. You can repair and replace that workstation. You can throw it in the garbage and buy a new one. You'll be operational by the afternoon. You're still, all your critical data is still not available. They don't see it because it's authenticated and it's accessed by a secure connection to the cloud. And if they happen to hit that, because it's in the cloud, you are forced to have strict authentication rules for how you access that. You have a login, potentially a two-factor authentication. They're not going to get in there unless they've got many layers of security have to fail for a user to be able to get past that zero trust infrastructure. They have to have your credentials. They have to have access to 2FA. And this is why zero trust is becoming a common one, and it's happening naturally in businesses. People go to Office 365. People are going to G Suite. They're going to Dropbox. They're using corporate Dropbox. They're using YouTube for storing corporate videos. They're using Salesforce.com. The companies are doing this themselves today, and they don't even know that they're slowly moving themselves into a zero trust. I can tell you the number of times that the last number of companies that I've worked at that use Salesforce.com have had zero outages because of breaches of Salesforce, and that's because that resource is not managed by us. It's managed by a third party that's focused on the security of their product. So you'll never be able to compare to somebody who's trying to protect their product from a breach. If you're trying to protect your service from a breach, that's a full-time job. So just to wrap up, you may not see your attackers, but they see you. If you've got devices that are online, that are publicly accessible on the internet, they're already on the radar of an attacker. So you remember that Shodan page where I showed you the cameras and I showed you all the data that they know? That's just scratching the surface. They know everything about your network. They know that your router's there. They scan it. If you look at the logs for your router or your firewall, you're getting scanned many times a day. And if you have devices that are available that have weak passwords that are likely already being used against you, maybe not against you or other people, know before you buy. Understand the technology you're buying, do your research, avoid buying a lemon you'll regret. Segment your network. It's easy. You can do it. So if you buy a router or an IoT router or just even set up VLANs, I'll accept any answer. All of the above is better than nothing. Most times I see nothing, and that's when we start seeing things get moved laterally across your network. Reduce your attack surface. If you don't need to have public access for something, don't provide it. Move to that zero trust model, which is, zero is the new hero, but that's a combination with reducing your attack surface. I think most companies in a number of years are finally going to adopt the fact that cloud is where you need to be. Again, a cloud just being somebody else's computer, reliable services that are cloud hosted, and you're going to have very little risk to your local network, and things are going to move there. Maybe it's a 5-year, maybe it's a 10-year transition, but I think zero trust is ultimately going to win out. And the same point from the last presentation, the mission is never accomplished. Cybersecurity is always a moving target. Cyber risk is always a moving target. So you need to keep up on this. What was secure today is weak tomorrow. If you have an out-of-date device, an IoT device that you did your research on, but then 5 years later, you're still using that device and there's vulnerabilities and they've gone out of business or they've stopped providing updates, know that that's happening. Don't be ignorant to it. And at the end, I just want to give you a plug for a free external scan. Those of you who are RootSecure customers already have this functionality in your dashboard. You can click on the reach button and do your own scan of your digital footprint. If you are not a RootSecure customer, we will still be able to do an external scan for you. So reach out after this webinar, and we're happy to run an external scan. It just comes out as an Excel report of all the different things that we know about your network. We run your network IPs and domains through Shodan. We run all the vulnerability scans we run normally internally, and we even do application-specific scanning. So if you're interested in getting that scan and understanding your digital footprint, again, customers, we're happy to walk you through enabling this yourself. If you're not a customer, please reach out and we're happy to run that scan for you. And now just to plug next month's webinar, we actually have a guest speaker, Don Bowman, who's the founder of Agilicus, which is a cloud security platform. So if you're dealing with anything with cloud security, virtualization, you have the ability to provide extra layers of security and you probably don't even know it. So if that's of interest, we'll be sending out the links for the webinar registration next month. I highly recommend anyone who's using virtualization or considering moving to virtualization, using cloud networks like AWS or Azure to consider attending this webinar. And if you know anyone who is using those technologies that would benefit from this, I think you'd find some really interesting data points here. So I want to thank everyone for joining. If there's any questions, we'll leave the chat open just for the next few minutes. And otherwise, I'll let you get back to your day. Looks like attendees are dropping off. So again, thank you very much for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us here at RootSecure, and we're happy to answer questions around IoT security and cyber risk.